He was labeled too broken to adopt. But when a silent little girl who hadn't spoken in months stood in front of his kennel, something unbelievable happened. Everyone thought she'd just point and walk away. But what if I told you this war-scarred German Shepherd didn't just find a home? He helped her find her voice again. Would you believe a dog could save a child's life without saying a word? Tell us in the comments. Do you believe in second chances like Ruger's? Subscribe for more real stories that will restore your faith in love, loyalty, and healing. Setting: Elk Hollow, Wyoming. Late autumn. The wind carried the smell of snow that hadn't yet fallen, but the air had already turned crisp and sharp, like the edge of a blade. The mountains to the north were frosted with early powder, and the cottonwoods had shed most of their golden leaves. Whisper Haven Animal Shelter stood on the edge of town, flanked by a weathered wooden fence and a row of wind-battered pine trees. The gravel parking lot was almost empty. Inside, behind thick panes of fog glass, the day began as it always did: cold, routine, and quietly heavy. Inside kennel number 4 lay Ruger, a 6-year-old German Shepherd with a thick sable coat, flecked with silver along the spine, as if time itself had run its fingers down his back. His eyes, amber, deep, and haunting, watched the world with a soldier's silence. His ears, once sharply alert, now drooped slightly, not from age but from disuse, from weariness. Ruger had served overseas with a K-9 unit. Bomb detection, patrol. His file said high drive, tactical, reactive. And after his handler died in an IED blast outside Fallujah, Ruger had been sent home to nowhere. Shelters weren't built for dogs like him. Too trained to be a pet, too broken to be of service. Ruger had cycled through 2 adoptions, both returned within weeks. People wanted loyalty, but not the kind that came with trauma. They wanted soft eyes, not a stare that had seen death. So now he lay still, head resting between his paws, not looking at the world so much as through it. Across the hallway, the shelter's assistant manager Luke Mathers walked with slow steps and a clipboard tucked under one arm. In his mid-30s, Luke had the weather-beaten look of someone who belonged more to stables than spreadsheets. His brown hair was always tousled, his jeans perpetually dusted in dog hair, and his boots left trails of hay behind him. Luke had once dreamed of veterinary school, but life in Elk Hollow and a family health crisis kept him grounded. He had a patient way with animals and a short temper with bureaucracy. Most of the staff steered clear when he was having a bad day, but the dogs liked him just fine. Luke paused in front of Kennel 4. Still not eating, he muttered, peering at the untouched kibble. "Small? Ruger. You gotta meet me halfway, buddy." But Ruger didn't move, didn't blink, just breathed. Back in town, a small gray house with blue shutters sat quietly on Maple Street. Sarah Whitmore, a retired librarian in her early 70s, stood by the front door, tying a scarf around her granddaughter's neck. Sarah was a small woman with sharp green eyes and thick white hair pulled into a loose braid. She had a kind face, wrinkled, yes, but warm like a book left open on a sunny windowsill. Her life had been quiet until last spring, when the accident stole her daughter, her son-in-law, and Sophie's voice in a single, violent moment. The police said it was instant. The doctor said Sophie hadn't been physically hurt. But since that day, not one word had passed her lips. Sophie Whitmore, just 9 years old, stood small and motionless in her oversized denim coat, a purple knitted hat pulled low over her forehead. Her red curls peeked out the sides, and her freckled cheeks were flushed from the cold. Her hazel eyes were wide, watchful, but quiet. Always quiet. She hadn't cried in months, not in front of anyone. And Sarah, as strong as she had been, was starting to unravel in the silence. "Just for a visit," Sarah said gently, locking the front door. No pressure, just a look at the animals. Sophie didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her small hand slipped into Sarah's wool-gloved one, and that was enough. Whisper Haven looked plain from the outside, almost sad in its functionality. A wind chime on the porch clattered like brittle bones. Inside, the air smelled of bleach, fur, and hope stretched too thin. Dogs barked in various tones, excited, nervous, pleading. A ginger tabby curled on the front counter, uninterested in the day's visitors. Luke looked up as the bell over the door chimed. "Morning," he called, and his voice softened when he saw Sophie. "Hey there, miss. You here to say hi to our crew?" Sarah nodded for both of them. "She's just here to look. We're just easing back into the world, I suppose." Luke gave a short, understanding nod. "Take your time. Walk down the left. Kennels are numbered. Most of the dogs are friendly. If you need quiet, number 4's your guy." The hallway was narrow, echoing with sound and tail thumps. Sophie walked slowly, her boots quiet on the tile. She peered into each kennel as they passed. A one-eyed husky, a hyperactive beagle mix, a shaggy terrier with a lopsided grin. But none of them held her attention, until she reached number 4. Ruger lay still inside. Unlike the others, he didn't rush the gate. He didn't bark. He didn't even lift his ears. Just those eyes, ancient and amber, locked onto Sophie's face. Sophie stopped. She didn't kneel, didn't wave. She simply stood, the way a tree stands against the wind. Ruger stared back. Sarah caught up and began to speak, but something in the stillness held her. Is this one okay?" she whispered to Luke, who had followed from behind. Luke folded his arms. "That's Ruger, ex-military. He's been through things no dog should see. People try to adopt him sometimes, but he's not easy." Sophie slowly crouched down in front of the gate, tucking her knees beneath her coat. She didn't reach out. She didn't say a word. Ruger, after a long pause, did something he hadn't done in weeks. He got up, quietly, carefully. He walked to the edge of the gate and sat, head low, gaze level. And then, as if answering a question no one had spoken aloud, he pressed his nose gently to the wire. Sophie raised her hand, small and pink intermittent. She placed it over his nose, separated by metal, but touching all the same. Sarah didn't speak. She felt something shift in the air, like the wind had changed direction. Luke stared. Well, I'll be damned. The fluorescent lights of Whisper Haven hummed faintly overhead, casting a cold glow on the gray concrete floors. Somewhere in the back, a beagle barked rhythmically, and a volunteer's laughter echoed as they coaxed a puppy into a leash. But in front of kennel number 4, the world was still. The wind outside knocked softly on the shelter windows, and golden afternoon light spilled in through a high window, catching in Sophie Whitmore's red curls as she crouched by the gate. Sophie didn't blink. Her mittened hand remained pressed gently against the steel mesh of Ruger's kennel, unmoving except for the rise and fall of her breath. Across from her, Ruger, the sable German shepherd with a soldier's eyes, leaned forward again, pressing his black nose just to the edge of her palm. For the first time in months, he wasn't looking past someone. He was seeing her. Luke Mathers stood a few steps behind Sarah Whitmore, arms crossed, his boot tapping the tiled floor in quiet disbelief. I've never seen him move like that for anyone," he muttered. "He usually doesn't even get up when the food tray comes." Sarah, watching from behind her glasses, felt something sharp twist in her chest. "Maybe he sees something familiar in her," she said softly. "Someone who won't expect too much from him." Her voice broke slightly at the end, but she covered it with a brisk exhale. "Let's not crowd them." Across the lobby, another staff member entered, a tall, lean woman in her late 20s with cropped blonde hair and a clipboard hugged to her chest. This was Haley Brent, a part-time vet tech and full-time animal behavior student, known for her efficient gait and no-nonsense tone. Her jeans were tucked into mud-stained boots, and she wore a faded maroon hoodie that read University of Montana, Animal Sciences. Haley raised an eyebrow as she spotted Luke and Sarah standing still in the hallway. "Let me guess," she said, approaching. "Number 4 still being a brick wall?" Luke tilted his head. "Not today." Haley walked up beside them and leaned slightly to see around the corner, and stopped. "Holy crap," she whispered. Neither Ruger nor Sophie had moved. They simply sat there, locked in an unspoken thread that seemed too delicate to breathe through. Haley frowned slightly, shifting into analytical mode. "She's not reaching into the space. That's good. And he's not showing teeth, no tail tension. He's grounded, slow breathing. That's not defense, that's engagement." "She hasn't spoken since the accident," Sarah said quietly. "She barely even reacts to music anymore. And now look at her." "Haley, usually skeptical of poetic moments, just nodded. I'd log this. This isn't just curiosity. That's imprinting. Down the hallway, the moment finally shifted. Sophie stood slowly, her hand leaving the gate like a leaf drifting from a branch. Ruger watched her rise. He didn't bark, didn't whine, but he stayed at the front of the kennel, eyes following her every move. As Sarah and Sophie walked back toward the exit, Sarah placed a hand on her granddaughter's shoulder. "Did you like that one?" she asked, voice gentle. Sophie gave a tiny nod. Not the kind people give when they want to be polite, the kind you give when your heart has quietly changed course. Luke lingered by the desk. "We don't usually recommend Ruger for adoption," he said slowly, glancing at Sarah. "He's got a record. He can be reactive, especially around noise, sudden movement. He's not a family dog, not a therapy dog. Not anymore." Sarah looked back toward Kennel 4, where Ruger still stood. "And yet, she picked him." "She did," Luke admitted. "He usually doesn't let anyone close." Sarah smiled, but it was faint. "Well, she doesn't say much either. They'll have that in common." Outside, the sky had shifted to that golden hour where everything looked softer, as if the world had forgotten how hard it could be. The wind was quieter now, less biting, more curious. As Sarah helped Sophie into the car, she saw something tucked in Sophie's coat pocket, her small sketchbook. It hadn't left the desk drawer in over 4 months. Back inside the shelter, Luke walked slowly toward Ruger's kennel. The dog sat back down now, resting his head on his paws again. But his eyes remained on the hallway, long after Sophie had gone. "You're going to break my heart, old man," Luke said quietly. "And hers too, if this is just a fluke." The next morning, Sarah made an unscheduled stop at the shelter. She didn't call ahead. She just showed up, Sophie in tow, dressed in her favorite purple coat with a missing button. Sophie had insisted, not with words, but with a determination that was rare. Standing at the door, shoes on, sketchbook clutched her chest. Luke wasn't on shift, but Haley was. She saw them enter and smiled, surprised. "Back again already?" Sarah gave a small laugh. "She wants to see him, and I figured no harm." Haley led them back, watching Sophie carefully. Ruger was lying down when they reached the kennel, but he lifted his head as soon as Sophie approached. This time, she didn't crouch. She simply sat cross-legged on the floor, sketchbook open, pencil in hand. She didn't touch the gate, didn't reach through. She just started drawing. After 10 minutes, Ruger came to the gate. "Saturday." Then, slowly, tentatively, he lay down, mirroring her pose. His ears perked forward, curious. She drew, page after page. Him lying down, him looking out, the scar along his muzzle, his eyes. When Haley finally broke the silence, it was only to say, "This isn't nothing." And she's not just watching him. She's studying him. He's the first thing she's cared to understand in months. Sarah stood quietly. What would it take for a trial placement? Haley's eyebrows rose. "With Ruger? Yes. I'll need to talk to Luke. But maybe it's time someone gives him the benefit of the doubt." At the front desk, Haley began filling out preliminary forms. Ruger's adoption file was thick with notes, some red-flagged, some cautious, but nothing in it warned against silent girls with gentle hands and the patience of snowfall. In the back, Sophie closed her sketchbook. She stood and gave Ruger one last look. No smile, no wave, just a nod. Ruger's tail moved just once. Outside, snow flurries had begun to fall, fine and aimless, painting the town white one silent flake at a time. The wind howled down from the mountains that Saturday afternoon, carrying with it the weight of early snow and the sharp scent of pine needles. The town of Elk Hollow was draped in winter's first whisper, a thin frost settling along rooftops and the edges of porch steps. Sarah Whitmore tugged her scarf tighter as she held the car door open, her other hand resting on the leash of the large German shepherd, now standing at her side. Ruger's body was taut. The thick sable fur along his shoulders bristled with tension, and his amber eyes darted across the quiet residential street. Every sound, the distant rumble of a snowplow, the rustle of dead leaves, sent flickers of uncertainty down his spine. His ears tilted toward every movement, and his breath came out in controlled but fast bursts, steaming into the cold air. Inside the car, Sophie Whitmore sat with her sketchbook balanced on her knees. She didn't look up as Ruger was guided closer, but her pencil had stopped moving. She was listening, sensing. The girl, still silent as ever, had not spoken a word in the days leading up to the trial adoption. But she had pointed at Ruger's picture on the brochure Luke had given them. She had drawn him again and again. When Sarah asked if she truly wanted him home, Sophie had nodded. Just once. It was enough. Sarah, practical and cautious, had spent the night before reading every line of Ruger's file. PTSD, reactivity to loud noises, difficulty with restraint. But there was something undeniable in the way Sophie looked at the dog, and in the way the dog responded to her. So Sarah, though afraid, had decided to trust what she didn't understand. As she opened the back door of her silver Subaru, Ruger hesitated. His paws, large and padded, hovered above the threshold. He glanced back toward the open street, ears twitching, and gave a low, warning huff. "It's all right," Sarah whispered, placing a gentle hand on his back. "We're going home." Inside the car, Sophie scooted over, making room. Still without speaking, she laid her hand lightly on the seat beside her. Ruger, sensing her presence, finally stepped in. For the first mile of the drive, things went smoothly. The engine hummed, the heat clicked on, and Sarah allowed herself the smallest hope. Ruger sat still, panting lightly, staring at the passing trees. Sophie rested her hand on the sketchbook, her eyes drifting toward Ruger's profile every so often. But halfway through their drive, as the road curved past the Elk Hollow High School, a motorcycle engine erupted from behind. Loud, sudden, a shrill roar as it passed their car. Ruger's transformation was instant. A guttural bark exploded from his chest, and he lunged forward, jerking against the leash that had been clipped to the seatbelt harness. The leash held, but only barely. Sarah swerved slightly, her hands gripping the wheel. Sophie gasped, body stiffening, eyes wide in alarm. Ruger's growl deepened, his muscles coiled like springs, barking now at every sound, at the world. "Ruger, no," Sarah called, trying to keep calm, but her voice cracked under the pressure. The car's interior felt suddenly too small, too full of energy and fear. Sophie curled away into her corner, hands over her ears, not crying, but on the edge of something else. Something broken. By the time they pulled into the driveway, the house seemed unfamiliar, hostile. Sarah parked quickly and opened the back door. "Come on, Ruger. Come on out," she said with trembling hands. Ruger leapt out before she could grab the leash, barking wildly at the snowblower being used 2 houses down. He paced back and forth on the frozen lawn, hackles up. Inside the house, Sarah guided Sophie in first. The girl walked slowly, her shoulders rigid, her silence heavier than before. Ruger remained on the porch, pacing, barking once more before Sarah got the leash back on him and pulled him inside. She had prepared everything: a soft dog bed near the fireplace, a water bowl, a bone, and even a new collar with a tag that read Ruger, trial placement. But nothing about the home calmed the dog. Ruger stalked the living room in large circles, sniffing aggressively, tail low but twitching. Sophie sat on the couch, arms wrapped around her knees, sketchbook forgotten on the coffee table. An hour passed like that, unease thick as smoke. Then the breaking point came. A pot on the stove boiled over. The hiss of steam, sudden and sharp, caused Ruger to snap his head toward the kitchen. He lunged, barking again, and this time Sophie shrieked, a sound torn from the deep. Not words, not a scream, but a guttural, frightened cry. Sarah ran to her, pulling her into her arms. "It's okay, baby, it's okay," she whispered over and over, but Sophie was shaking violently. Across the room, Ruger had backed into a corner, ears pinned, eyes wild, breathing hard. For the first time since bringing him home, Sarah looked at him not with cautious hope, but with fear. That night, Sarah paced the hallway long after Sophie had gone to bed. The house was silent, except for the occasional sound of Ruger shifting uneasily in his crate. He hadn't barked since the incident. He hadn't made a sound, but he hadn't relaxed either. Sarah stood in the kitchen, holding her cell phone. Luke's contact pulled up. Her thumb hovered over the call button. Was this the right decision? She glanced at the fridge, where Sophie's drawing of Ruger, taped just this morning, was beginning to curl at the corners. The kitchen light was the only one still on in the house, casting a warm, golden glow across the tiled floor and faded wallpaper. The silence was thick, but not the kind that suffocates. It was the kind that waited, unsure of what might happen next. The clock above the fridge ticked quietly toward midnight, and Sarah Whitmore stood by the back door, her hand on the knob, heart aching in two directions. The leash hung over her wrist. The phone call to the shelter had not been made. Not yet. Ruger sat a few feet away, his body still tense, but no longer wild. His ears had lowered, not in defeat, but in a kind of tired surrender. He didn't bark. He didn't resist. He just sat there, watching the door. And then, without a sound, Sophie appeared. Barefoot, in her flannel pajamas, she stepped into the kitchen with hesitant steps. Her face was pale in the lamplight, her curls tousled from sleep. She stopped just short of the door, her eyes not on her grandmother, but on Ruger. Then something extraordinary happened. Sophie moved past Sarah, past the leash, past the open debate of adult decisions, and walked straight to Ruger. She didn't kneel. She didn't speak, but she wrapped her arms around his neck and buried her face into his fur. Ruger froze, unsure for only a moment. Then, slowly, he exhaled and lowered his head, resting it lightly against the girl's shoulder. Sarah stared. Her throat tightened as she saw it. That look, a flicker of life in Sophie's eyes that hadn't been there for months. Not since the accident. It wasn't full of joy or trust or even comfort. It was something smaller but stronger, resolve. Sophie had made her choice. Sarah let her hand slip from the doorknob. The leash dropped to the floor with a soft thud. In the days that followed, everything changed in small, quiet ways. The house, which had once echoed with absence, began to hum with cautious effort. Sarah, though retired from her post at the Elk Hollow Public Library, found herself back in research mode. She pulled out dusty books on canine behavior, ordered guides on military canine rehabilitation, and printed old articles written by trainers with years of experience. It was her nature to prepare, to learn, to adapt, that had once made her a great librarian, and now it made her something else, a bridge. She even reached out to an old acquaintance, Mike Delaney, a retired canine handler who now lived on the outskirts of town. Mike, in his early 60s, was a broad-shouldered man with sun-spotted skin, a limp in his right leg, and a weathered face framed by a thick gray beard. His voice was low, slow, and sure, and his handshake still carried the strength of old commands. When Sarah explained the situation, he didn't offer judgment, only time. "I've seen dogs like him," Mike said one afternoon as he stood in their living room, watching Ruger from across the space. "You don't fix them with treats or baby talk. You fix them with structure. Consistency. Trust has to come first, and it comes slow. But if that girl's his anchor, don't break that thread." Mike agreed to check in weekly, offering Sarah guidance and simple drills to rebuild Ruger's sense of safety, both his and the family's. Meanwhile, Sophie began to do something else remarkable. She started writing. On the small whiteboard Sarah had stuck to the fridge months ago for grocery lists, Sophie began scrawling short, shaky words with a dry erase marker. Ruger, then stay, and later, good. Every day, a new word appeared. Sometimes commands, sometimes thoughts, sometimes just his name. Sophie also took to carrying around an old digital camera Sarah had once used during family road trips. She had found it buried in a drawer and offered it without expecting much. But Sophie surprised her. She photographed Ruger constantly, sleeping, pacing, staring out the window. And then she started drawing from the photos, translating the camera's stillness into lines that pulsed with meaning. The transformation wasn't instant. Ruger still flinched at sudden sounds. He still barked at the mail truck, but he no longer paced at night. He no longer growled at the shadow of the hallway. He would now lie down by the fireplace, close enough to Sophie that their warmth touched. One morning, Sarah found them curled together on the living room rug, Ruger with his head resting on his paws, eyes half-lidded, and Sophie leaning against his side with a sketch pad balanced on her knees. She didn't wake. even as Sarah quietly stepped into the room. Sarah, who had lived through widowhood, who had buried her daughter and son-in-law, and faced the impossible task of raising a grief-stricken child again, felt a small, solid hope press into her ribs. That evening, after Mike's third visit, he stood on the porch with his hands in his coat pockets. The snow had melted slightly, revealing patches of brown earth and yellow grass. "You're doing all right, Whitmore," he said. "Just don't rush it. That dog's not a pet. He's a survivor. But so's your girl, from the looks of it." Inside the house, Sophie added a new word to the board: home. Ruger sat in the corner watching her with his quiet eyes. He wasn't sure what it meant, not exactly. But the way Sophie smiled as she wrote it, the way Sarah exhaled when she saw it, told him it was something worth staying for. The skies above Elk Hollow were the color of pale linen, stretched wide and cloudless, with the sun blinking through like a lantern behind frosted glass. Spring had arrived quietly, sneaking into the bones of the thawing ground. Patches of snow still lingered in the shadows, but the fields had begun to green. Behind Sarah Whitmore's modest house, with a backyard spilled into open barley land owned by a neighboring farm, the earth was soft and the wind restless. It whistled through the tall, leafless trees, stirred forgotten seed husks, and swept across the open land with the impatience of change. Ruger stood at the edge of the field, eyes fixed on the wide, open space. His stance was alert but relaxed, tail neutral, ears twitching. He had been coming out here more often lately. Sophie's idea. Every morning after breakfast, she would grab her small denim backpack, tuck in a water bottle and her sketchbook, and motion to the leash hanging by the door. It didn't need words. Ruger understood her rhythm now, the subtle signals of her world. That afternoon, the wind had picked up more than usual, pushing shadows across the barley stalks and lifting Sophie's red curls into the air as she jogged ahead. She wore her favorite green flannel shirt and a pair of old canvas sneakers, the toes scuffed from use. Ruger trotted beside her, leash dangling loosely in Sarah's hand until they reached the familiar fence line where the private property ended and the barley field began. Sarah, ever the watchful guardian, stood by the fence, leaning slightly on a walking stick she had started using after a winter fall. Her sharp green eyes were hidden behind sun-glinting glasses, and her silver braid was tucked neatly into her scarf. Though her body was slower, her mind was as brisk and organized as ever. "Just for 15 minutes, she called after Sophie, who responded with a nod before unclipping Ruger's leash. The dog didn't bolt. Instead, he paused, glanced back at Sarah, then bounded into the open like a released breath. Sophie followed, laughing silently, her feet light across the uneven ground. From a distance, they looked like something out of a dream, a girl and her dog chasing the wind. Ruger ran in wide arcs, his muscles remembering freedom, his legs long and sure. Sophie twirled once in the grass, arms lifted, and then dropped to her knees, sketchbook in hand, capturing the dog mid-run, mid-leap, mid-bark. But then the wind changed. A strong gust swept down from the hills, sudden and sharp, and it caught Sophie off balance. Her body turned too quickly. Her foot caught on a root half buried in the earth, and she fell with a muffled thump into the dirt. Her sketchbook landed open beside her, pages fluttering. The fall wasn't violent, but the surprise of it, combined with the rush of wind and the vastness of the open field, froze her. Sarah hadn't seen the fall. She had turned to pull a thermos from her canvas bag and pour a bit of coffee. When she looked back, Ruger was standing still, tail stiff, eyes locked on something beyond her view. Then he moved, swiftly but not in panic. He ran back in the field, barking once, short and sharp. Sarah's heart clenched. "Sophie," she called. No answer. "Sophie." Her voice cracked. The wind swallowed it. She dropped her thermos, picked up her cane, and hobbled forward, heart hammering. "Sophie." Ruger appeared at the edge of the barley, barked again, then ran a few feet further in and stopped. His tail waved high, ears erect. He barked a third time, then threw back his head and let out a long, wavering howl. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even desperate, but it cut through Sarah like lightning. Following his signal, She moved as fast as her legs would carry her, boots slipping on the soft ground, her coat flapping behind her like a flag. Ruger ran ahead and stopped again, just over a slight rise. As Sarah climbed the slope, breath ragged, she finally saw them. Sophie was curled on the ground, clutching Ruger's neck with both arms. Her face was pressed against his shoulder, her legs tucked beneath her. The dog stood like a sentinel, unmoving, solid, shielding her from the wind. Sarah dropped to her knees beside them, fear spilling from her eyes before her voice could find footing. "Sweetheart, are you hurt?" Sophie didn't look up. Sarah's hands hovered, unsure whether to pull her up or let her be. "Talk to me, baby, please." And then, from the shelter of Ruger's fur, came a whisper, a voice. "Stay." The word was so faint, so fragile, Sarah nearly thought she imagined it. But Ruger heard it too. His ears turned, and his body leaned slightly into the girl. Sophie repeated it, louder this time, her voice cracking from disuse. "Stay." Sarah let out a sob, a stunned, breathless laugh wrapped in tears. "Oh my God, Sophie." She didn't move, not yet. She just reached forward and laid a hand on Ruger's back. The dog shifted slightly, but didn't move away. By the time they stretched its fingers fully across Elk Hollow, the barley fields had turned a gentle green, and the chill that once clung to the air had melted into soft breezes and scattered birdsong. The town itself, small and stubborn, was beginning to thaw in more ways than one. Children returned to their school routines without winter coats. Porch swings creaked again in the afternoons, and life, quiet, kind, and deeply rooted, settled into a gentler rhythm. At the center of this quiet shift stood a girl, her dog, and a community beginning to believe in the impossible. Sophie Whitmore walked a little taller these days. Her gait was still cautious, as if the world might vanish if she moved too fast, but there was a lightness to her steps, a subtle lift to her chin. She didn't speak much, but she no longer hid behind silence. At school, she responded with nods, pointed fingers, even soft hums of agreement. Her teachers, especially Miss Jennings, a young woman with short auburn hair and a patchwork wardrobe that changed colors with her mood, learned to read her just as carefully as Ruger did. Miss Jennings, barely 30, had a warm but no-nonsense nature. She had been teaching third grade at Elk Hollow Elementary for 5 years, known for the way she built trust through small rituals, sticky notes with gentle reminders, morning songs, a secret classroom handshake. When Sophie returned to school with Ruger at her side, Miss Jennings didn't panic. Instead, she pulled an extra mat from the nap cubby and said, "He's got a place here too." Ruger's transition into a therapy dog had been fast-tracked after his field rescue with Sophie. Mike Delaney, the retired canine handler who had been helping Sarah, vouched for the dog's reliability and drive. He wasn't broken, Mike had said simply, just waiting for the right mission. Sarah had cried quietly in her car after that conversation. The town rallied behind the story. Luke Mathers, who had been following Ruger's progress since day one, began scribbling notes into a worn leather journal late at night. When the idea came to him, he didn't hesitate. He marched into the mayor's office, an aging colonial building tucked behind the general store, and pitched it straight to Mayor Catherine Downey. Mayor Downey was in her early 60s, a tall woman with snowy white hair cut to her shoulders and the kind of posture that made people instinctively sit up straighter. She had grown up in Elk Hollow and never once considered leaving. Her leadership was rooted in kindness and pragmatism, often carrying a slight dry wit. "Let me get this straight," she'd said, arching an eyebrow. "You want to start a fund for dogs that don't behave?" Luke had smiled. "I want to start a fund for dogs who've been told they're too much work. The ones who've been passed over. We'll call it Second Bark. We train them, rebuild them, give them a second chance to find where they belong." Mayor Downey had leaned back in her chair, folded her hands, and after a long pause, simply nodded. "Give me a story that'll make the papers. We'll launch it with a bang." And so, a month later, the park was decorated with balloons and folding chairs. Local businesses donated snacks, students painted signs, and the high school jazz quartet tuned their instruments in the shade of a maple tree. The sky was wide and bright above them, dotted with a few drifting clouds like gentle punctuation marks. It was the first time Elk Hollow had gathered like this in over a year. Sophie stood just behind the stage, her small hand clutching Ruger's leash. She wore a navy blue dress with embroidered stars along the collar. Picked by Sarah, who stood off to the side in her gray sweater and long skirt, hands twisting nervously around a paper program. Luke stood nearby, clipboard in hand, his flannel shirt wrinkled and his boots dusty. When Sophie's name was called, the crowd hushed. The young girl took one step forward, then another, Ruger beside her. His gait was calm, measured. Not a soldier now, but a guardian. As they reached the podium, Sophie paused. She looked out at the sea of faces, her classmates, the mayor, Miss Jennings, even Mike Delaney in his leather vest and ball cap. Ruger sat down, eyes fixed on her, waiting. Sophie lifted the microphone with both hands. For a second, all was still. Then she spoke. "He saved me too." 3 simple words. Steady, clear. And in that moment, the silence broke like morning light. The crowd rose to their feet. Applause swelled across the park, and Sarah covered her mouth with one trembling hand. Miss Jennings clapped so hard her bracelets jangled. Luke blinked fast and pretended the sun was in his eyes. Mayor Downey nodded slowly, eyes shining, and muttered, "Well, there's your headline." Ruger gave one sharp bark, not aggressive, not startled, just strong, certain, as if to say she's right. Later, as the music played and cookies were passed around, Luke walked to the edge of the park and opened his journal. On a fresh page, under the title Second Bark Launch, he wrote, "It started with a broken dog and a silent girl. Neither expected to save the other. But they did. Under the same sky, people shared stories, laughter, and cautious hopes. And somewhere between the breeze and the clapping, Sophie leaned down and whispered into Ruger's ear, 'Home. Life doesn't always give us second chances, but sometimes love does.' This story reminds us that healing doesn't always come with noise or speed. Sometimes it arrives quietly, through trust, through presence, through a bond that asks for nothing but stays through everything. Ruger was never meant to be perfect. Neither was Sophie. And yet, together, they found something whole. In a world that often looks away from what seems broken, this is your reminder. No soul is too far gone to be seen, to be loved, to be restored. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who still believes in hope. Leave a comment and tell us, who was your Ruger? Or just type him in if you believe in second chances and quiet miracles. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that lift the spirit. And may God bless you and everyone who's still waiting to be seen.